Hey guys, welcome back, quiet historians, to another gentle drift through the annals of the past here on Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, as the world outside settles into its hushed rhythm, we're embarking on a journey that might just redefine everything you thought you knew about matters of the heart. Forget the flowery poems and the valiant knights rescuing damsels. We're peeling back the layers to reveal a medieval world where personal choice, especially in love, was less a romantic ideal and more a strategic negotiation fraught with unspoken rules and societal pressures. If these calm explorations resonate with you and you find peace in these historical drifts, perhaps consider a gentle tap on the subscribe button and a soft like on the video. And feel free to share a quiet hello in the comments below, letting us know where you're drifting from tonight. Allow your mind to softly drift as we journey back to a time where the grand tapestry of life, love and marriage was woven not by individual threads of desire, but by the sturdy, often unyielding ropes of collective survival, societal expectation, and economic necessity. The Middle Ages, a period frequently painted with broad strokes of romanticism in our modern imaginations, truly presented a stark, unyielding reality where individual choices, particularly concerning affairs of the heart, were seldom, if ever, genuinely personal. Imagine, if you will, existing in an era where your deepest feelings and most intimate desires were not merely secondary, but often entirely subservient to a vast, intricate web of external forces. Your existence, from the moment you drew your first breath, was meticulously governed by an almost unbreakable framework. The pervasive weight of societal expectations, the biting realities of economic necessities, and the unyielding, often crushing influence of your family, the omnipresent church, and the Lord who held dominion over your very land and being. Survival wasn't just a concept, it was the daily tangible rhythm of existence. It dictated everything from the food on your table to the alliances your family forged, and this primal need for continuation extended its long, inescapable shadow over any pursuit of what we might now call romantic love. Social stability, an elusive yet deeply coveted state, alongside the relentless preservation of lineage, the continuation of your family's name and its fortunes, were the undisputed dictators of life's rhythms. These were the true arbiters of who you would marry when you would marry, and even how you might conduct yourself in the perilous dance of medieval courtship. Within this incredibly complex, often brutally pragmatic framework, individuals if you had lived then, were compelled to navigate a unique and often bewildering landscape of courtship and marriage. This was a landscape so far removed from our contemporary notions of intimacy and personal freedom that it might feel like an alien planet. Instead of whispered promises and shared dreams, it was governed by an intricate, almost invisible set of unspoken rules, and sometimes these rules were painfully explicitly laid out with little room for deviation. Every interaction, every gesture, every whispered word held a weight that is almost impossible for us to fully grasp today, as it could directly impact not just your personal happiness, but the very survival and reputation of your entire family line. You would be entering a world where affection was a dangerous commodity and marriage a binding transaction forever, under the watchful eye of a society that valued conformity above all else. Stepping into this meticulously structured social arena, you would quickly grasp that the very concept of dating as we understand it today, a private, evolving courtship where two individuals explore their compatibility at their leisure, was utterly non-existent. Instead, every interaction that even hinted at a romantic inclination was excruciatingly public, rigidly formal, and for the most part relentlessly chaperoned. Imagine for a moment, if you will, the sheer overwhelming awkwardness of a first encounter. You might find yourself seated across a hall from a complete stranger, perhaps at a grand feast or a humble village gathering, acutely aware that your future, your very fate, was likely being sealed not by shared laughter or burgeoning affection, but by stern-faced negotiations over the number of livestock your family owned, or the precise acreage of land that would comprise your dowry. A genuine connection, a whisper of true understanding, would feel less like a blossoming romance and more like a carefully orchestrated covert operation conducted under the unblinking gaze of an entire community. The low murmur of voices and the nervous darting glances exchanged across a crowded feast hall were often the only true forms of communication allowed. The constant clatter of pewter against wooden tables, the rich earthy scent of roasting meat, and the boisterous sounds of communal merriment would paradoxically fail to drown out the palpable tension of unspoken desires and the calculated observations of those around you. Every slight movement, every shift in your seat, every fleeting flicker of your eyes was a potential data point analysed and dissected by watchful eyes. You might catch a glimpse of the individual designated as your potential spouse, perhaps from across the bustling village square as you drew water from the well, or during a seemingly mundane trip to the market. But any true private conversation, any real moment to gauge interest or personality, was a luxury rarely afforded. Chaperones be they vigilant parents, watchful older siblings, or even respected community elders were omnipresent. Their very presence was a constant reminder that this was not a journey of personal discovery, but a public performance with high stakes for your entire family's standing. Consider the sheer mental gymnastics required to simply exist in such a system, let alone attempt to convey a sliver of genuine interest. Modern expressions of affection, those casual conversations or leisurely walks designed to simply get to know someone, were not merely frowned upon, they were practically unheard of. To engage in such direct displays, to overtly flirt or engage in light-hearted banter, risked swift and severe social condemnation. You were in essence performing for an invisible audience every gesture, a judgment, every carefully chosen word, a potential misstep. The pressure to conform, to maintain a facade of appropriate detached decorum was immense. This stringent control over public interaction meant that the subtle art of conveying affection had to rely on the most veiled of messages, on non-verbal cues so delicate they could be mistaken for accident. A barely perceptible nod from across a crowded hall, a lingering glance at the communal well, or the quiet exchange of a small, discreetly hand-carved token, each of these held the potential for profound meaning, yet each was also freighted with the constant agonizing risk of misinterpretation. Your fate in many ways was less about what you said, and far more about what was left unsaid in the charged silences and the carefully managed distances between souls. From the nuanced language of silence and carefully managed distances, you can begin to truly appreciate the sheer peril of expressing anything that resembled a personal opinion, particularly if it veered even slightly from your family's or your lord's wishes regarding a potential spouse. In a society where conformity was king, or rather where the collective good of the lineage reigned supreme, expressing individuality in such a critical matter was not seen as a sign of strength or authenticity. Instead, it was viewed as a significant liability, an act of defiance, almost a declaration of rebellion against the established order. Imagine the delicate tightrope you would walk, knowing that a single ill-considered word could not only derail a potential match, but also bring shame and disfavour upon your entire household. There was no room for just not feeling it, or for a quiet discussion about your hopes and dreams. Your hopes and dreams were by and large already predetermined by the needs of your family. This pervasive scrutiny extended to every physical interaction, making even the simplest contact between unmarried individuals a high-wire act. A seemingly innocuous brush of hands, a fleeting touch of fingertips as you passed a shared platter, or even an accidental jostle in a bustling market was not simply a physical encounter. It was highly scrutinised, potentially misinterpreted as a direct declaration of illicit intent inviting swift and damaging scandal. The consequences were dire, far beyond a modern-day awkward shrug or a polite apology. Such an incident could be whispered about in church for weeks, your reputation shredded, and your marital prospects irrevocably tainted. It was an environment that bred a profound level of self-consciousness, where every movement was calculated, every casual gesture rigorously controlled for fear of the devastating social repercussions. Therefore, the subtle art of conveying affection had to rely on the most exquisite forms of veiled messages and non-verbal cues, a secret language spoken through gestures that could be plausibly denied. A slight, almost imperceptible nod from across a busy hall, a lingering glance at the communal well, as you both drew water, or the quiet exchange of a small discreet hand-carved token, perhaps a wooden bird, a pressed flower, or a tiny embroidered swatch of fabric. Each of these was freighted with immense emotional weight and potential meaning. Yet each also carried the constant agonizing risk of misinterpretation. Was that nod a sign of interest or merely an acknowledgement of presence? Did that lingering glance speak of affection or simply a momentary distraction? The ambiguity was key to plausible deniability, allowing for the intricate dance of forbidden or undeclared longing to play out without overt transgression. Silence itself became a powerful, often agonizing form of communication in this world of veiled intentions. You were expected to infer interest or disinterest, not from direct affirmations or rejections, but from absences, from delayed responses to your subtle cues, or from the careful management of distance. A person who always seemed to be just out of reach or whose eyes never quite met yours was speaking volumes without uttering a single word. And humour, that essential lubricant of modern social interaction if dared in a romantic context, walked an exceptionally perilous tightrope. A misplaced jest could be seen as frivolous, insincere, or even deeply insulting in a society that viewed marriage as a grave transaction, a serious commitment to lineage and survival, not a light-hearted romp. The overwhelming awkwardness of these first encounters, often with a complete stranger whose future was decided by land and livestock. Not shared laughter hangs heavily in the air, a tension as thick as the roasting meat scents in the hall. This profound lack of open, honest communication truly defined the medieval pursuit of partnership, setting the stage for every gesture to become a silent judgment. From the stifling constraints on personal expression, we now turn to the formal social gatherings themselves, which transcended mere social events, and instead functioned as highly ritualized tests of character. Imagine attending a feast, a village festival, or even a local market day, knowing that every single gesture, every word you uttered was being meticulously judged. While not a direct tea ceremony, in the Eastern sense, these public assemblies became profoundly important stages where flawless conduct was not merely desired but paramount. If you were a prospective suitor, or indeed anyone with an eye towards an advantageous match, you carried the immense, crushing burden of performing perfect etiquette. Any misstep in your manners, any awkwardness in your conversation, or even a slight hesitation in your responses would be immediately flagged and interpreted. Such a slip signalled not just a momentary lapse, but a dire lack of discipline, or worse, a fundamental deficit in social grace, making you a less desirable prospect. The choreographed social dance of noble gatherings was particularly demanding. Each interaction required meticulous navigation, a precision that would make a modern diplomat blush. Every gesture, from the depth of a bow to the precise way you held your goblet, every carefully chosen word in a polite exchange was implicitly yet universally judged by all present. There was an unspoken expectation of perfection, a silent scorecard being kept in the minds of parents, rivals, and even potential in-laws. This relentless pressure to impress and conform created an environment where genuine spontaneity was almost entirely suppressed. Who could truly relax, who could genuinely be themselves when every subtle movement or casual remark carried such monumental weight? The echoing sounds of precise greetings and formal responses filling the stone-walled hall, where the subtle scrape of chairs and the rustle of fine fabrics underscored the chillingly formal atmosphere, paint a vivid picture of this constant performance. It was a world where your worth was not measured by your inner qualities, but by your ability to flawlessly execute a centuries-old script. Beyond the spoken word, the act of composing poetry and letters emerged as a sophisticated, albeit highly coded language of longing. This wasn't just about communicating a message. It was an exacting discipline, a performance that reflected your inner grace, your intellect, and even in the eyes of many, the very purity of your soul. Imagine spending hours, perhaps under the soft glow of a flickering candle, meticulously penning a verse on rough parchment, carefully choosing each word to evoke emotion, while simultaneously adhering to strict poetic forms and cryptic metaphors. This was the delicate balance required, conveying genuine feeling while rigidly adhering to societal restraint. Personal expressions of emotion, especially in love letters, could not be direct. They had to be wrapped in layers of symbolism, allusion, and formal structure, protecting the writer from accusations of inappropriate passion should the letter fall into the wrong hands. The quality of your penmanship, the elegance of your prose, or the cleverness of your verse were not merely aesthetic considerations. They were subject to severe social judgments, profoundly impacting your perceived character, and crucially your suitability for marriage. A poorly composed poem, a clumsy letter, or even a simple grammatical error was not simply bad art. It was a damning indication of a disordered mind, shallow emotions, or a lack of proper education, all deeply undermining a suitor's standing. Consider a young man, perhaps hopelessly smitten, who might spend agonizing hours meticulously crafting such a verse, perhaps even dusting it with flower petals or a faint sweet scent of perfume, only for the recipient's confessor or a suspicious parent to intercept it and screen it for moral content, chilling any nascent romantic spark before it could even begin to glow. This ritual often performed in the hushed quiet of a moonlit chamber, hoping for clandestine delivery highlights, the intense pressure and the intricate, often frustrating dance of communication in a world where true feelings had to be cloaked in layers of formal discipline. Sometimes these formal expressions found their way into even more cryptic forms, the exchange of tokens, which carried their own unique dangers. The intricate dance of communication, often cloaked in formal discipline, found a particularly vexing expression in the use of tokens. Imagine these small, seemingly innocuous objects, a solitary glove, an embroidered sleeve, a discarded ribbon, or even a precious lock of hair as the 12th century equivalent of texting. They were slow, inherently confusing, and extraordinarily prone to wildly inaccurate interpretation, yet they carried immense emotional weight capable of sealing fates or igniting feuds. The beauty and terror of tokens lay precisely in their cryptic nature. Everyone knew what it meant, and no one said what it meant. This ambiguity allowed for a crucial element of plausible deniability. You could always shrug and declare, "Oh, this glove. It just appeared on my pillow scented with lavender, completely random," even when its true meaning was blindingly obvious to all involved. But this very ambiguity was a double-edged sword, especially for women. Handing the wrong guy the wrong token could instantly, irrevocably commit a woman to an undesirable match, illustrating the profound strategic and often perilous nature of these seemingly small gestures. It wasn't just a miscommunication, it was a profound social blunder with potentially devastating real-world consequences. Imagine the social minefield of receiving an unwanted token, perhaps a crudely carved wooden spoon from a suitor you found utterly repugnant. You couldn't simply throw it away or ignore it. You had to navigate the delicate art of polite refusal, avoiding direct insult to his lineage or his family, while simultaneously making it abundantly clear that your affections lay elsewhere. This required a level of social finesse that would test even the most astute modern diplomat, all to avoid a family feud or a damaged reputation. Consider the desperate romanticism and sheer practical absurdity encapsulated in the act of a knight, perhaps hopelessly, almost comically in love, mailing a lady his embroidered sleeve. What you in our modern sensibilities might interpret as a grand gesture could easily leave the recipient with little more than a sweaty linen sleeve and the romantic burden of pretending you know what it means. It's this precise blend of earnest intent and baffling practicality that makes the medieval token so utterly fascinating. The unexpected weight of a small carved wooden spoon, perhaps a gift of provision, or the silken feel of a ribbon from a garment, each object became a silent, tangible whisper of affection, or just as often an unwelcome obligation. Their meaning was heavy with unsaid things, a language of objects that spoke louder than any words, echoing the unspoken truths and calculated observations that permeated medieval society. Beyond these tangible objects, the pervasive influence of the Church cast a long, unblinking shadow over all matters of courtship and marriage. It played an omnipresent and highly regulatory role, defining not just what was permissible, but what was sinful, asserting its divine authority with unwavering conviction. Priests from the pulpit delivered sermons filled with stark warnings detailing the proper conduct expected of young men and women. And in a pre-printing press world, lengthy treatises on the dangers of flirtation were meticulously copied by hand circulated and devoured by the literate few. These weren't mere suggestions. They acted as medieval anti-flirting manuals, detailed guidebooks on how not to engage in anything that might be construed as inappropriate, controlling both public and private behaviours to an astonishing degree. This constant spiritual oversight permeated every aspect of daily life, from the simplest interactions to the most profound decisions, setting the stage for the intertwining of the sacred and the superstitious in matters of the heart. As if the unblinking gaze of the Church weren't enough, medieval courtship and marriage were further complicated by a profound intertwining of spiritual frameworks and pervasive superstition. Imagine navigating the complexities of human affection under the twin pressures of divine judgment and the constant nagging anxiety of unseen omens. Astrology, for instance, held significant sway over perceptions of compatibility. You might find yourself quietly fretting over whether Venus was in retrograde on your birth chart, or if you were simply born under an unlucky moon. Believing these celestial alignments could irrevocably dictate the success or failure of a potential union. Beyond the stars, more earthly yet equally mysterious beliefs held sway. A peculiar birthmark on a prospective spouse might not be a mere dermatological quirk. It could be interpreted as a divine sign, perhaps signifying a destined soulmate, or chillingly, a destined executioner, a person whose fate was ominously intertwined with your own demise. Omens were everywhere, guiding decisions and fueling anxieties with their often ambiguous pronouncements. A raven flying overhead while you were deep in thought about someone could be instantly interpreted as a bad sign, a dark portent for your romantic aspirations. Dropping a piece of bread at dinner while your eyes lingered perhaps a moment too long on your crush across the table could be seen as a clear indication of a cursed union, a relationship doomed to failure from the very start. Every minor event, every seemingly random occurrence had the potential to be read as a sign of either blessing or doom, creating a constant low-level hum of anxiety for medieval hopefuls. This constant awareness of unseen forces, this delicate dance between faith and folklore, meant that every step in courtship was taken with a mixture of prayer and trepidation. The heavy scent of incense in a church combined with the drone of a priest's sermon on the perils of lust would reinforce the divine judgment. Meanwhile, outside the wind, howling through the eaves, would rattle the superstitious, turning every rustle and creak into a perceived ill omen. even within the hallowed, supposedly unbreachable walls of monasteries and convents, where vows of chastity were paramount and spiritual devotion was the sole pursuit, forbidden love found a way. Human hearts, it seems, are notoriously resilient and tragically prone to inconvenient affections. Passionate letters, meticulously crafted and deeply felt, would be disguised as theological musings or scholarly debates smuggled between cloistered lovers under the very noses of their superiors. The stakes for such illicit affections were astronomically high, risking severe ecclesiastical punishment that could range from public humiliation and severe penance to whipping solitary confinement or even lifelong exile to a remote, desolate abbey known mostly for sheep and silence. The emotional detail here is striking the profound, constant anxiety of navigating a courtship under the unblinking gaze of both divine judgment and pervasive superstition, where every minor event could be a sign of blessing or doom. This pervasive spiritual and superstitious framework deeply influenced the fundamental nature of marriage itself, which in medieval society was fundamentally a pragmatic alliance, a legally binding transaction. Far from a dreamy vow of personal affection, it was often negotiated with the unromantic passion of a livestock auction. Every detail was meticulously scrutinized, every asset weighed, and every potential benefit calculated. Romantic love, particularly if it blossomed before or heaven forbid outside of marriage, was almost universally deemed risky, scandalous, and generally frowned upon by society. It was largely confined to the realm of tragic poems and fictional narratives, beautiful and heartbreaking on parchment, but dangerous and disruptive in real life. This foundational understanding of marriage as a contract rather than a culmination of emotional desire sets the stage for the deeply constrained agency faced by medieval women, a reality rooted in their social standing. As we delve deeper into the pragmatic alliances that defined medieval unions, the deeply constrained agency for women in relationships becomes starkly apparent. Their choices, from the most mundane daily decisions to the life-altering path of marriage, were almost entirely dictated by the unyielding needs of their family, be it for survival, the intricate politics of inheritance, or the preservation of social stability. A woman's dowry, whether it was coin clothing or a suspiciously generous number of geese, wasn't just a financial contribution. It was a crucial factor, almost a prerequisite determining her marital prospects, and by extension her perceived worth in the grand economic exchange of medieval society. Without a dowry, a woman's options for a respectable marriage were severely limited, if not entirely non-existent, forcing many into convents, or to eke out a meagre existence through solitary labour. Transgressions, particularly those against the strict moral codes governing sexual conduct like adultery, were not merely private affairs. They were severe scandals capable of ripping through the social fabric of a community, potentially leading to immediate social ostracism and severe legal or social repercussions. Imagine the pervasive public shame that would attach itself to an individual, or even an entire family tainted by such a scandal. There was no escaping the whispers, the pointed fingers, the lasting stain on one's reputation. This harsh reality underscored the rigid expectations and the absolute intolerance for deviations from the prescribed marital and social norms. For a woman, the consequences of such a transgression were often far more devastating than for a man, highlighting the deeply unequal standards of the time. Yet life is rarely so black and white, even in the rigid structures of the Middle Ages. While formal marriage was the rule, concubinage, though generally lacking the full recognition and legal protections of marriage, was sometimes practiced, particularly by the elite. This added complex layers to family structures, blurring lines, and often involving delicate navigation of social and legal boundaries. These relationships, while not openly celebrated, were sometimes tolerated out of necessity, convenience, or even genuine affection, creating a quiet shadow world of domestic arrangements that existed alongside the more formal ones. It's a reminder that even within the strictest societal frameworks, human desires and practicalities can find unexpected avenues for expression. And despite the often contractual nature of medieval marriage, where love was an afterthought or perhaps a happy accident, it is crucial to remember that some couples genuinely did grow to love each other. Picture, if you will, partnerships forged not in the crucible of grand passion, but through the shared hardships of daily life. Love blossomed slowly, quietly, born out of habit, mutual respect, and the sheer pragmatic experience of daily survival. These were not the soaring, idealized romances of troubadour songs, but perhaps a quieter, deeper affection rooted in shared resilience. Couples might attend separate feasts as the emotional details suggest quietly resenting the circumstances that brought them together, yet still find a quiet affection amidst the struggle. The faint rustle of legal parchments and the solemn tones of the priest during the wedding ceremony, accompanied by the murmured calculations of a dowry, physically represented the wealth and status that underpinned every marital negotiation. This was the cold, hard reality of medieval unions, a reality indelibly shaped by the invisible cage of clan identity. Flowing directly from the contractual nature of marriage, we encounter perhaps the most invisible, yet profoundly restrictive cage for the medieval individual, the overwhelming weight of clan identity, or individualism, that cornerstone of modern self-perception, was largely suppressed, almost entirely subsumed by the collective. Your clan served as your primary source of identity, your reputation and your social standing completely overshadowing any personal desires or aspirations you might harbour. Imagine the agonizing pressure of knowing that your personal choices, particularly in matters of love and honour, could bring shame or glory to an entire lineage, reaching back through generations and stretching forward into the distant future. Your actions had a generational impact, reflecting directly on your ancestors and casting a long shadow over your descendants for good or ill. Scandal, especially something as dramatic as a noble elopement, was not merely a personal rebellion against convention. It was viewed as political sabotage, akin to lighting your family tree on fire. The chaos and profound disgrace it would cause within the family and wider society were immeasurable. It could unravel carefully constructed alliances, jeopardize land holdings, and utterly destroy a family's standing for decades. Public shame and pervasive gossip were incredibly powerful, insidious mechanisms of social control, far more effective than any formal law in some cases. Youthful indiscretions were not easily forgotten or forgiven. They could be dissected and discussed in church for weeks long after the event itself had passed, keeping the shame alive and potent. The sharp intake of breath and the hushed whispers that followed a scandalous rumour through the village would feel like invisible ropes tightening around those implicated, a constant chilling reminder of the community's watchful eye. This collective reputation of the family dictated choices with an iron fist. Parents, of course, held immense sway, but their decisions were often influenced by the broader network of their peers and the prevailing social climate. Priests, as we've seen, were vigilant moral guardians, quick to condemn any deviation from the prescribed path. But perhaps most insidious of all was the local gossip network, an informal yet incredibly powerful entity that played a critical role in approving or disapproving courtships. This pervasive web of watchful eyes and wagging tongues ensured conformity to societal expectations, making sure that individual desires were constantly checked against communal norms. To fall afoul of the gossip network was to invite a social death, a chilling excommunication from the very fabric of your world. Moving beyond these social strictures, we begin to consider the very physical context of medieval intimacy, the living conditions and shelter that further dictated the possibilities for personal moments. The stark differences in housing structures, from damp, basic, thatched huts for commoners to chilly echoing stone castles for the nobility, reveal a common thread: profound lack of true privacy. For the vast majority of people, privacy was virtually non-existent. Imagine sharing a small, often single-room dwelling with multiple generations of your family, perhaps even unrelated individuals who are part of your household or extended workforce. Truly private conversations, tender gestures, or even a moment of quiet reflection became an almost unattainable luxury. The constant absence of privacy, which cast a long shadow over any fleeting hopes for intimacy, extended even to the grander, albeit often colder, noble homes. While certainly larger than a peasant's hut, these stone castles and manor houses frequently suffered from a distinct lack of thermal comfort. Imagine the echoing chill of their vast corridors, the draughts that would seep through every crack in the stone, making any attempt at quiet intimacy a physical challenge in itself. Beyond the temperature, the very structure of noble life meant the constant presence of servants, retainers, and guards. Every corner seemed to hold an unseen eye, every conversation could be overheard, every seemingly private moment rendered utterly public. Thus, intimate moments remained fleeting, stolen glances in a crowded courtyard or hurried whispers in a dimly lit antechamber, far from the cherished solitude we associate with romantic privacy today. Upon marriage, peasant couples typically found themselves continuing this communal existence. They might move into an already shared hut, perhaps with the groom's family, or if fortunate, build a new one with the collective help of the village. This act of communal building symbolized a basic, profoundly practical commitment to shared domestic survival. The home itself, cobbled together with local materials and community effort, became a product of cooperation, a physical manifestation of a union founded on necessity rather than tender sentiment. The quiet longing for a private moment, a shared glance across a bustling communal space, was a constant undercurrent, a poignant reminder that true intimacy was a rare luxury snatched in brief, almost accidental fragments. The pervasive smell of hearth ash and damp earth in a peasant hut, or the echoing chill of a stone castle's corridors made any attempt at quiet intimacy difficult if not impossible, casting a long shadow over daily life and relationships, profoundly influencing the practicalities of partnership embodied in the daily struggle for food. Beyond the walls of their dwellings, the very practicalities of securing food and sustaining life profoundly shaped medieval partnerships. Common food sources were often monotonous and dictated by the seasons, reflecting the harsh realities of agricultural life. Staples like grain cooked into porridge, or simple forms of bread combined with root vegetables such as onions and turnips, defined the daily existence for the vast majority. This pervasive reality of a limited diet influenced everything, even the subtle negotiations surrounding marital unions. For instance, the discussion might not revolve around a suitor's charming smile, but rather his family's access to a particularly fertile patch of land or the reliability of their seasonal harvest. Scarcity was not an occasional inconvenience. It was a pervasive, unyielding reality that defined much of medieval life. This made effective food preservation methods absolutely essential for survival through the lean, brutal months of winter. Without them, starvation was a constant threat. Thus, a potential spouse's knowledge of curing meat, pickling vegetables, or properly storing grain was far more valuable than any poetic verse. The ability to contribute to the household's food security was a significant mark of a good spouse, transforming what we see as domestic chores into life or death skills. A man who could gut a fish with practiced ease, or a family blessed with a productive goat, was not merely desirable. They were vital assets in a world where sustenance was a daily struggle. This deeply pragmatic approach to partnership, rooted in the very act of putting food on the table, further underscores the transactional nature of medieval unions, a reality as palpable as the aroma of boiling cabbage emanating from a peasant's pot. The pungent aroma of boiling cabbage and turnips, a constant earthy companion to a peasant's pot, contrasted sharply with the richer, more complex scents of roasted meats and sweet pastries wafting from a lord's kitchen. This stark olfactory difference painted a clear picture of the class-based access to food, a brutal reality that permeated every aspect of medieval society and deeply influenced marital prospects. While the elite enjoyed a wider variety of foods, even for them, food remained a central economic aspect of any household, a symbol of power and provision. For peasants, a marriage alliance might hinge on the sheer utility of a potential partner. Could he ensure there was enough to eat? Could she manage a household with scarce resources? These were not minor considerations. They were the bedrock upon which any successful union in the practical sense was built. Consider a micro-narrative, a quiet moment of courtship far removed from our modern ideals. A peasant suitor, perhaps a bit nervous, cautiously offering his beloved a good turnip from his meagre harvest. This wasn't a bouquet of roses or a box of chocolates. It was a modest yet deeply meaningful gesture of provision in a world perpetually teetering on the edge of scarcity. It was a subtle act of courtship, a quiet promise of competence and care, speaking volumes about his ability to provide for a family, a trait far more appealing than a charming personality. The ability to work the land to produce sustenance was the ultimate declaration of husband material. Adding another layer to the unseen realities of medieval life, we must consider the topic of hygiene and personal care, a realm that, while rarely romanticized, profoundly impacted daily interactions and the very concept of intimacy. Daily hygiene practices for commoners were rudimentary at best, involving cold washes, often from a shared basin or stream, and basic, often homemade soap. Imagine the consistent earthy smell of unwashed bodies and damp clothing a stark background to daily life. This pervasive lack of personal freshness and the generally low standards of cleanliness meant that basic practicalities such as a potential partner who doesn't visibly recoil at the sight of your feet were more relevant considerations than sophisticated grooming or appealing scents. Modern sensibilities accustomed to daily showers and deodorants would find this reality quite startling, a subtle yet pervasive challenge to any romantic ideal. The very tokens exchanged, like the sweaty linen sleeve we discussed earlier, suggest a profoundly different tolerance for personal odours and a more intimate, if perhaps unhygienic, connection through worn garments. These objects, imbued with personal scent and residual warmth, reflected the inescapable realities of daily life, where physical closeness often meant an unavoidable awareness of another's natural state. Occasionally this earthy reality might be broken by the fleeting scent of lavender on a noble's secret token, a stark contrast that highlighted the vast divide between the classes even in matters of personal comfort. This raw, unfiltered closeness, necessitated by living conditions and limited resources, underscored that medieval life left little room for the refined distances we often associate with modern courtship. Instead, practicality was woven into the very fabric of personal interactions, extending even to the daily labour and responsibilities that formed the silent foundations of a shared life. The constant earthy smell of unwashed bodies and damp clothing was not merely a background detail. It was a pervasive reality where daily labour and physical exertion were paramount, forming the very foundations of any shared life. For peasants, life was utterly dominated by physically demanding agricultural toil. Imagine the rhythmic thud of a peasant hoe breaking hard earth, or the ceaseless churn of grain being ground at the local mill. These were the rhythms that shaped their entire existence profoundly, influencing their social interactions and the very nature of their relationships. Courtship, if it happened at all, often intertwined with these shared tasks. Conversations were not confined to formal gatherings. They happened during shared chores, like the slow, steady walk to the village well with a heavy bucket, or while tending sheep on a windswept hillside, their wool rough against your hands. This integration of social interaction into the relentless rhythm of work meant that a potential partner's competence and reliability in performing their labour effectively were key traits of desirability. Charm or superficial looks paled in comparison to the ability to contribute meaningfully to the household's survival. A man who could consistently thatch a roof that doesn't leak too much, or a woman who could expertly preserve the harvest, were considered far more valuable prospects than someone merely attractive. This emphasis on competence over charisma formed the practical basis for any union, a quiet unsung form of love found in the shared satisfaction of productive labour. The rhythmic thud of a peasant hoe breaking hard earth, or the steady, almost hypnotic pull of thread through fabric during embroidery, each sound was a testament to the daily grind and the foundational elements of a shared life, a stark contrast to the noble's world. For noble women, labour often took a different form, but it was no less demanding. It encompassed managing vast households, overseeing servants, handling accounts, and engaging in skilled crafts like elaborate embroidery. For an unmarried noblewoman, especially one whose family might lack a substantial dowry, such skills were not mere pastimes. They could be a solitary yet vital pursuit demonstrating her worth and potential contribution to a future household. Meanwhile, noble men were consumed by demanding social and administrative duties, managing sprawling estates, engaging in complex political maneuvers, or undergoing rigorous military training. These responsibilities consumed much of their time and energy, leaving precious little room for the leisurely pursuit of romance, or the frivolous amusements that modern dating implies. Their lives were dominated by strategy and duty, echoing a childhood designed entirely to prepare them for predetermined unions. This brings us to the very beginning of life's journey, for medieval children, their childhood and education, which served not for individual fulfillment, but as a meticulous preparation for predetermined unions. For many, particularly those born into noble families, childhood was shockingly brief and often shaped by early betrothals. Imagine being promised in marriage, before your voice dropped, a solemn agreement made by your parents while you were still a child, your future sealed before you had any understanding of what marriage truly meant. For some, the first meeting between spouses would occur only on the wedding day itself, cementing a profound sense of predetermined fate, stripping away any illusion of choice or personal agency. The stark reality of a future predetermined with marriages arranged sometimes even before the individuals involved had developed their adult voices meant that education was not about personal growth or the pursuit of individual passions. Instead, it was strictly class-based and relentlessly vocational. Peasant children from the tenderest of ages learned practical skills essential for immediate survival and for contributing their share to the family unit. Imagine a young peasant girl learning the gentle slap of dough in a kitchen, or a boy mastering the rhythm of a blacksmith's hammer in the distant clang of the forge. These were not hobbies. They were life skills, preparing them for a future where their hands and their practical competence would be their most valuable assets in the relentless struggle for daily existence. Noble children, conversely, were prepared for their very specific, often equally demanding roles in courtly or military life. A young noblewoman would be tutored in household management, the intricate art of diplomacy, and perhaps the quiet skills of embroidery, all designed to make her an advantageous match and a capable mistress of an estate. A young nobleman would undergo rigorous training in horsemanship, swordsmanship, and strategy, preparing him for warfare or the complex administration of his family's lands. Gender-specific training was not just prevalent, it was absolute. Girls were meticulously taught domestic skills and crafts, while boys were prepared for physical labour or the brutal realities of warfare depending entirely on their station. Every lesson, every skill imparted was explicitly in preparation for an adult role that served the family's social and economic stability, particularly through strategic marriage alliances. The purpose of childhood, in essence, was to forge a perfect cog in the great machinery of lineage and survival, not to cultivate a unique individual. This profound lack of individual fulfillment in childhood directly fed into the overarching framework of medieval society, an inescapable social hierarchy and fixed destiny. Imagine a world where your potential, your opportunities, and crucially your matrimonial prospects were fundamentally determined from the moment of your birth. Medieval society was rigidly structured by an immutable social hierarchy, a towering pyramid from the highest nobility to the humblest peasants, the bustling merchants, and the unfortunate outcasts. Your position within this unyielding order was rarely, if ever, mutable. You were born into your place, and that place largely dictated your destiny. Personal desires, as we've seen, were always secondary to this fixed order. Parents held immense authority, but so too did local lords or powerful religious figures. These individuals acted as the ultimate arbiters over marriage decisions, especially for the elite. For nobles, it was common to be betrothed since before your voice dropped, with agreements made in infancy tying families together for generations through strategic political and economic calculations. Marriage for the elite was not about romance. It was primarily about securing land titles and family alliances, reinforcing the cold hard truth that individuals were merely strategic pawns in much larger political and economic games, their personal affections utterly irrelevant in the grand scheme. Even for peasants whose lives were perhaps less grandly political, the family still held a strong say, prioritizing practical skills and resources like a productive goat or a boy who could thatch a roof over fleeting romantic sentiment. This rigid, all-encompassing social stratification formed the economic rules of marriage rules as tangible as the very wealth beneath their feet, the silent, unspoken rules of deference and address that permeated every social interaction, a constant hum of hierarchical awareness underlying daily life, were never more apparent than in the dictation of a life partner. You were perpetually aware of your place, and that awareness informed every potential romantic gesture, every whisper of affection, and every decision your family made on your behalf. This rigid structure led us naturally to the core economic drivers of medieval life, which fundamentally dictated the terms of courtship and marriage, effectively transforming what we might consider love into an intricate, often cold transaction. Whether your world revolved around the agrarian cycle of crops and livestock or the bustling trade routes of a burgeoning town, the economy was the ultimate matchmaker. For men, the proof of husband material was not a charming personality or a winning smile. It demanded tangible assets, land or livestock or tools or a roof that doesn't leak too much. Think of it, two healthy oxen people understood, spoke a language of security that no heartfelt sonnet could ever hope to match. A man's ability to provide, to contribute concrete resources to the household was the gold standard of desirability. His worth was measured in the strength of his arm, the fertility of his land, and the health of his animals, not the depth of his feelings. It was a stark, practical assessment stripped bare of romantic pretense. For women, the dowry was not merely important. It was a crucial prerequisite, an entry ticket to marital prospects. This dowry could take many forms: a pouch of coin, a chest full of clothing, or even in a delightfully medieval touch, a suspiciously generous number of geese. Whatever its form, the dowry directly determined her marital prospects and her perceived worth in the economic exchange that was marriage. Without it, her options were bleak, often leading to a life of spinsterhood or a cloistered existence within a convent. It was her tangible contribution, her stake in the new household, and without it she had little leverage or appeal. In some regions, the transactional nature of marriage was even more explicit with the practice of a bride price. Here the groom paid the bride's family often with valuable commodities such as a horse, a cloak, and 3 pigs. This was in its stark simplicity, medieval romance at its finest, a clear financial exchange that underscored the utilitarian basis of these unions. There was no pretense of grand passion. It was a direct transfer of wealth in exchange for a partner, a worker, a bearer of children, and a strategic alliance. Marriage, therefore, was inherently practical. For peasants, it was often driven by the intensely utilitarian consideration that pig pen borders someone else's wheat field. The desire for romantic passion took a back seat to the pressing need for irrigation rights, or the strategic advantage of neighbouring fields. The flutter of a heart was a minor detail compared to the tangible weight of a sack of coins, the rustle of legal deeds, or the lowing of livestock physically representing the wealth and status that underpinned every marital negotiation. These were the true arbiters of worth, not fleeting emotions, and this practicality extended even to the very laws surrounding these unions. The tangible weight of wealth physically represented by sacks of coins and lowing livestock formed the very essence of marital negotiation in the medieval world, eclipsing any personal affection. And once agreed upon the dowry, this crucial economic bedrock of the union typically became an integral part of the husband's household economy. It was managed by him and crucially guarded by law, making its return after an annulment or death often harder than pulling a sword from a stone. This legal rigidity demonstrated the strict economic rules governing unions, emphasizing their practical binding nature over any personal sentiment. Imagine the sheer difficulty of trying to reclaim your family's assets once they had been absorbed into another's household, a bureaucratic nightmare wrapped in medieval legalities. Beyond the human-made systems of hierarchy and economy, medieval existence was characterized by an even more pervasive and unyielding force: nature's relentless fury and the universal threats it posed. Plague's harsh winters, devastating floods, and recurrent famines were not distant headlines. They were constant, tangible realities, creating a perpetual struggle for survival that permeated every single decision, including the momentous one of marriage. There was no escaping the biting chill of a medieval winter wind seeping through cracks and walls, or the pervasive damp smell of an unheated home, a constant raw reminder of nature's indifference and the essential need for a resilient partner. These environmental challenges were not just inconvenient, they were life-threatening. The widespread lack of formal relief efforts meant that communities and individual families relied heavily on their own resources and alliances to weather these recurrent crises. There were no national aid programs, no widespread charitable organizations to offer succor. Survival depended on the strength of your immediate network, your kin, and your chosen partner. This made strong marital partnerships not merely desirable, but a matter of life or death. For peasants in particular, the ability to survive winter together became the most profound practical definition of chemistry. It wasn't about shared hobbies or intellectual compatibility. It was about the tangible, undeniable proof of resilience and shared fortitude. Could this person endure hardship by your side? Could they pull their weight when resources were scarce and the cold bit deep? These were the core rules of survival that informed marital decisions, transforming romance into a strategic alliance against shared hardships. Marital partnerships, especially for commoners, were thus forged by the daily reality of hauling firewood in the rain, mending leaky roofs, and enduring the quiet suffering of hunger and cold. This demonstrated unequivocally that comfort and romance were secondary considerations to resilience and pragmatic cooperation. Love, if it was to exist, had to emerge from the crucible of shared suffering, a bond forged in the fires of necessity. The chilling realization for medieval hopefuls was that a potential partner's true value lay not in their charm or their looks, but in their demonstrable ability to endure hardship, to contribute to the grim, relentless task of simply staying alive. This sobering truth stands in stark contrast to modern romantic ideals pulling back the curtain on the fundamental power hierarchies that further controlled every aspect of medieval existence. From the chilling realities of a life perpetually shadowed by nature's fury, we now turn to the unyielding power hierarchy that defined medieval society, a system that in practice felt less like a structure and more like an invisible set of chains. The immediate superior's will, be it a father, a feudal lord, or a powerful religious abbot, often functioned as unwritten law concerning personal matters, especially the monumental decision of marriage. Their dictates demanded unquestioning obedience, leaving little to no room for individual dissent or even polite disagreement. Imagine living in a world where your deepest desires for companionship, for a family of your own, were entirely subject to the whims and strategic calculations of someone else. Noble marriages, in particular, were not affairs of the heart, but direct reflections of political favours and strategic alliances. Individuals, regardless of their personal feelings, were often little more than instruments in a grander game of maintaining or expanding power, with virtually no agency in their own choices. A powerful family might marry off a daughter to cement a fragile peace, or arrange a son's union to secure a valuable piece of land. These were cold, calculated decisions made with the precision of a chess master, where the pawns, the bride and groom, were expected to move without question. The emotional detail here is profound, the feeling of being trapped by the will of others, knowing that one's deepest desires were insignificant against the dictates of power and lineage, a suffocating realization. The Church, as we've noted, asserted its pervasive authority by regulating courtship, functioning rather like a vigilant guardian, at the very threshold of matrimony. Priests, as we briefly touched upon, weren't just delivering sermons, they were actively publishing anti-flirting manuals, treatises meticulously copied and distributed detailing acceptable and unacceptable public and private behaviours. These prescriptive texts were designed to control every aspect of social interaction, from a lingering glance to a whispered word, ensuring that passion remained within the strict confines of marital duty and religious approval. The stern judging gaze of a village elder, or the solemn, unyielding pronouncements from a lord's court continually reinforced this pervasive sense of being under constant watch and judgment. Every move was observed, every potential misstep noted, creating an environment where conformity was not merely encouraged but enforced. This strict control over personal lives through hierarchical power flowed directly into the legal and enforcement mechanisms of the era, which reinforced bonds that were virtually unbreakable and rules that were immovable. Marriage at its core was fundamentally a legally binding transaction, not a personal choice born of affection. Think of the meticulous formal contracts painstakingly negotiated over dowry land rights and material possessions, often with public witnesses solemnizing the agreement. These documents etched onto parchment were the true testaments to a medieval union, solidifying its place as a legal and economic arrangement first and foremost. The cold, unyielding feel of church stone underfoot during a ceremony, and the priest's Latin pronouncements, often a barrier to comprehension for the common person, symbolized the rigid, unbending laws governing a medieval union. The concept of individual rights so cherished in modern society was largely absent in this era. Instead, the will of one's social superior or the deeply ingrained community norms almost invariably superseded any notion of personal autonomy, especially when it came to marital disputes. You might have grievances, you might suffer unhappiness, but your personal desires or sense of injustice held little sway against the established order. Your place in the hierarchy dictated your entitlements, and personal agency was often a luxury afforded to very few. Perhaps one of the most striking differences between medieval and modern marriage was the near impossibility of divorce. Marriage was not just a contract, it was considered a sacred and unbreakable bond, approved by the Church and crucially sealed by God Himself. Once consecrated, this bond was enforced not just by a rigid legal framework, but also by the powerful, pervasive mechanism of public shame. To seek divorce was to defy divine will and invite profound social condemnation. There was no easy escape hatch, no modern-day legal pathways for dissolution based on incompatibility or irreconcilable differences. Annulments, while technically possible, were incredibly difficult to obtain. Think of it as demanding a Herculean effort of paperwork, a whisper of good fortune, and it must be said a judiciously placed coin or two to even be considered. Even then they were granted only for very specific, legally provable reasons. These included instances where one party was underage if the couple was deemed too closely related by the Church's strict consanguinity laws, or if the marriage was provably non-consummated. Imagine the tedious, deeply invasive process of proving a non-consummated marriage for an annulment, possibly requiring written confirmation, perhaps even under oath from both parties or even witnesses. This highlights the extreme intrusiveness of legal mechanisms into the most private aspects of medieval lives, making escape from an undesirable union an almost insurmountable challenge. This rigidity in marriage laws brings us to the ultimate forms of societal control, the shadow of death and the potent force of honour. The concept of honour was deeply interwoven with societal control, extending its influence over every perceived transgression related to courtship and marriage. Your honour, and by extension your family's honour, was a priceless commodity, more valuable than land or gold in some respects, and its defence could demand extreme measures. Adultery, for instance, was not simply a private affair. It was a scandal, or worse, carrying immense social stigma and potentially severe legal repercussions, which could range from heavy fines and public humiliation to physical punishment. This demonstrated honour's direct role as a tool of state or lordly power, a mechanism for maintaining order and conformity. Noble elopements, though romanticised in countless legends and ballads, were in reality viewed with absolute gravity, far from a whimsical adventure. They were considered outright acts of political sabotage, capable of destabilising alliances and challenging the authority of powerful families. The potential punishments for such illicit unions were horrifying, ranging from excommunication from the Church, a complete severance from one's social world and spiritual solace, to, for the groom, disembowelment, a direct and brutal application of punitive power. The chilling finality of an excommunication notice, its stark words echoing the complete severance, would be a constant, terrifying possibility. This constant fear of societal wrath, knowing that a single misstep could lead to public humiliation, a ruined reputation, or even death, cast a perpetual shadow over any forbidden affection, making every clandestine encounter a gamble with the highest of stakes. The stark words of an excommunication notice signalling a complete severance from one's social world and spiritual solace were a chilling reminder of the ultimate punishments awaiting those who defied the rigid medieval order. This pervasive fear of societal wrath, knowing that a single misstep could lead to public humiliation or even death, cast a constant, terrifying shadow over any forbidden affection, even within the supposedly tranquil confines of religious orders, where monks and nuns dedicated their lives to spiritual pursuits and vows of celibacy. Forbidden love was perhaps inevitably present and deeply discouraged. The Church, ever vigilant, imposed severe punishments for those who dared to transgress these sacred vows. Punishments could range from whipping and exile to public penance or reassignment, to remote abbeys known mostly for sheep and silence. A slow, agonising social death far from any form of community or intellectual stimulation. While these dramatic forms of punishment and control highlight the iron grip of authority, it's also important to consider the quieter forms of resistance and resilience that existed particularly among the peasant classes. While large-scale peasant rebellions like the Japanese Ikki or European peasant revolts are fascinating in their own right, they are not directly relevant to the specific daily realities of love and marriage we're exploring. However, the underlying causes of peasant suffering, heavy taxes, recurrent famines and corrupt officials, were deeply felt grievances constantly adding pressure to marital choices. In a world defined by such hardships, the decision to marry was rarely about individual romantic desire, but rather about pragmatic alliance. The struggle for survival, that relentless pursuit of merely staying alive and the essential need to survive winter together for peasants, often push them into practical marriages. This subtly highlights their enduring discontent with harsh conditions and, paradoxically, their profound resilience in the face of adversity. A marriage that guaranteed an extra pair of hands for the harvest, or access to shared resources for warmth and food, was a form of silent negotiation within a rigid system. It was a practical, unsentimental act of resistance against a world designed to limit their personal freedom and opportunities, a small victory in the face of overwhelming odds. The economic basis of peasant marriage exemplified by considerations like how a pig pen borders someone else's wheat field, or the critical importance of irrigation rights, demonstrates how broader societal pressures fundamentally shaped individual intimate choices. These were not grand acts of defiance, but quiet everyday decisions that underscored a deeper struggle for autonomy. Even the choice to try again in a second marriage, often made for profoundly pragmatic reasons, rather than a resurgence of grand passion, reflects a form of quiet persistence against a world designed to limit personal freedom. Perhaps the first spouse had died from plague or famine, leaving children to care for and land to work. Finding another partner not for romance, but for the sheer necessity of survival and continuation, was a testament to the human spirit's ability to adapt and endure. This wasn't a glamorous story of triumphant love, but a more subtle rebellion against fate, a determination to find a form of contentment despite overwhelming limitations. The steady, almost defiant glow of a fire being lit in a shared hut, a small warm victory against the biting cold, and the vast indifferent landscape perfectly encapsulates this quiet defiance, bringing us back to the introductory theme of romanticization versus harsh reality. The quiet defiance of a small fire glowing warmly in a hut, a poignant victory against the biting cold, brings us full circle to the overarching theme of this journey, how the Middle Ages, despite all our romanticized notions, presented a stark reality where personal choices, especially in matters of the heart, were rarely truly individual. We've peeled back the layers to reveal a world governed by an intricate web of societal expectations, economic necessities, and the unyielding influence of family, church, and lord. Survival, social stability, and the preservation of lineage were the dominant rhythms of existence, casting a long shadow over the pursuit of what we might call romantic love. Within this complex framework, individuals navigated a unique landscape of courtship and marriage, a landscape far removed from modern notions of intimacy and personal freedom. Instead, it was governed by an intricate set of unspoken and sometimes painfully explicit rules. The very concept of dating as a private evolving courtship was non-existent. Interactions were public, formal, and heavily chaperoned, making genuine connection feel like an act of espionage. Overt flirting, casual conversations, or leisurely walks to gauge interest were practically unheard of and deeply frowned upon, risking swift social condemnation. Expressing personal opinions, especially those that veered from family or lordly wishes regarding a potential spouse, was a significant liability viewed as defiance rather than individuality. Physical contact between unmarried individuals, even a simple brush of hands, was highly scrutinized and could be misinterpreted as a direct declaration of illicit intent inviting scandal. The subtle art of conveying affection relied on veiled messages and non-verbal cues, a nod from across a hall, a lingering glance at the well, the quiet exchange of a small hand-carved token, each freighted with potential misinterpretation. Silence was a powerful, often agonizing form of communication. One was expected to infer interest or disinterest from absences, delayed responses, or the careful management of distance. Humour, if dared in a romantic context, walked a perilous tightrope. A misplaced jest could be seen as frivolous or insulting in a society that viewed marriage as a grave transaction. The overwhelming awkwardness of a first encounter, often with a complete stranger knowing their fate was sealed by negotiations over livestock and land not shared. Laughter paints a vivid picture. Consider the soft murmur of voices and nervous darting glances exchanged across a crowded feast hall, where the clatter of pewter and the rich scent of roasting meat often fail to drown out the palpable tension of unspoken desires and calculated observations. These public gatherings were not merely social events, but highly ritualized stages where flawless conduct was paramount. Guests, particularly prospective suitors, carried the immense burden of performing perfect etiquette, as any misstep in manners or conversation signalled a dire lack of discipline or social grace. The choreographed social dance of noble gatherings required meticulous navigation. Every gesture, every bow, every carefully chosen word was implicitly judged by all present. The pressure to impress and conform created an environment where genuine spontaneity was suppressed in favour of rehearsed propriety. The echoing sounds of precise greetings and formal responses filling a stone-walled hall, where the subtle scrape of chairs and the rustle of fine fabrics underscored the chillingly formal atmosphere, were constant reminders of this performative existence flowing seamlessly into the intricacies of coded communication. The chillingly formal atmosphere of medieval social gatherings, where every movement and every word felt choreographed, naturally extended to the very act of communication, particularly in its most delicate and romantic forms. The composition of poetry and letters transcended mere communication. It was an exacting discipline that reflected one's inner grace, intellect, and even the perceived purity of one's soul. Imagine the immense weight of crafting a letter knowing that its penmanship, its elegance of prose, or the cleverness of its verse were subject to severe social judgments. This wasn't merely about conveying a message. It was about presenting yourself as a suitable and worthy individual, profoundly impacting your perceived character and suitability for marriage. A poorly composed poem or a clumsy letter was not just bad art in the medieval context. It was a damning indication of a disordered mind or shallow emotions deeply undermining a suitor's standing. It suggested a lack of education refinement, or perhaps even moral character. Consider the micro-narrative of a young man meticulously penning a verse on parchment, perhaps dusting it with flower petals as a tender flourish, only for the recipient's confessor to screen it for moral content. Such a reality would effectively chill any romantic spark, reducing a heartfelt gesture to a mere theological audit. The persistent scratch of a quill on rough parchment, the faint sweet scent of perfume mingled with ink, all performed in the hushed quiet of a moonlit chamber, were part of a private ritual conducted with the intense hope for clandestine delivery. A hope often dashed by the omnipresent scrutiny of the era. And then there were tokens. These small tangible objects, a glove, an embroidered sleeve, a ribbon, a piece of hair, were, as we briefly mentioned, the 12th century texting slow, confusing and prone to wildly inaccurate interpretation, yet carrying immense emotional weight. Handing the wrong guy the wrong token could tragically instantly commit a woman to an undesirable match, illustrating the profound strategic and dangerous nature of these seemingly small gestures. It was a game of subtle declarations where the rules were often unwritten and the stakes incredibly high. The cryptic nature was paramount. Everyone knew what it meant and no one said what it meant, allowing for that crucial plausible deniability. Oh, this glove, it just appeared on my pillow scented with lavender, completely random. One might feign even as the implication hung heavy in the air. Receiving an unwanted token meant navigating the delicate art of polite refusal without insulting lineage or provoking a powerful family, a social minefield that could lead to dire consequences if mishandled. Imagine a knight hopelessly in love mailing a lady his embroidered sleeve, leaving her with a sweaty linen sleeve, and the romantic burden of pretending you know what it means. The unexpected weight of a small carved wooden spoon, or the silken feel of a ribbon, each object a silent, tangible whisper of affection or obligation, its meaning heavy with unsaid things, perfectly encapsulates the profound layers of unspoken communication. In this era, a reality profoundly shaped by spiritual frameworks and superstition. The weight of unsaid things communicated through subtle tokens and veiled gestures was further compounded by the pervasive influence of spiritual frameworks and superstition which intertwined to shape every aspect of love and marriage in the Middle Ages. The Church, as an omnipresent and highly regulatory force, asserted its divine authority by meticulously defining what was permissible and, more often, what was sinful. Priests didn't just deliver sermons, they acted as moral gatekeepers, their pronouncements detailing proper conduct, echoing through stone-walled churches. Imagine being lectured on the dangers of flirtation from a lengthy treatise meticulously copied by hand and widely distributed. These were in essence medieval anti-flirting manuals, dictating public and private behaviours, with an iron fist asserting a powerful moral control over the populace. But the spiritual wasn't always clear-cut. It often intertwined with deep-seated superstition. Astrology, for instance, could dictate perceived compatibility with anxious individuals fretting over Venus in retrograde, or being born under an unlucky moon. Believing these celestial alignments held sway over their romantic destinies. Beyond the stars, more earthly yet equally mysterious beliefs held sway. Mysterious birthmarks could be interpreted as divine signs, signifying a destined soulmate, or chillingly, a destined executioner, weaving a complex tapestry of fate and fear into personal relationships. Omens were everywhere, guiding decisions and fueling anxieties. A raven flying overhead while thinking of someone might be a bad sign, while dropping bread at dinner while glancing at a crush could foretell a cursed union. Every minor event, every seemingly random occurrence had the potential to be read as a sign of either blessing or doom, creating a constant low-level hum of anxiety for medieval hopefuls. This constant anxiety of navigating courtship under the unblinking gaze of both divine judgment and pervasive superstition meant that every step felt like a gamble. The heavy scent of incense in a church, the drone of a priest's sermon on the perils of lust while outside the wind howled, rattling the superstitious, with every perceived ill omen. These atmospheric details paint a vivid picture of the atmosphere, even within the supposedly secure walls of monasteries and convents, where vows of chastity were paramount, forbidden love found a way. Passionate letters, carefully disguised as theological musings, were exchanged, risking severe ecclesiastical punishment, from whipping and exile to public penance, or reassignment to remote abbeys, mostly for sheep and silence. This deeply ingrained spiritual and superstitious framework inevitably leads us to the harsh realities of a love marriage and family life itself. It was almost without exception a pragmatic alliance rather than a dream. Marriage was fundamentally a legally binding transaction, often negotiated with the unromantic passion of a livestock auction. Every detail, from the number of livestock to the acreage of land, was meticulously scrutinized and agreed upon by families, not by the individuals whose lives were being joined. Romantic love, particularly before or outside of marriage, was viewed as risky, scandalous, and generally frowned upon, largely confined to the realm of tragic poems and fictional narratives, beautiful on parchment, but dangerous in practice. This absence of personal choice, especially for women, was a defining characteristic. The absence of personal choice, a stark reality, particularly for women, meant that their marital destinies were almost entirely dictated by the pragmatic needs of their family. Survival, inheritance, and the preservation of social stability were the paramount concerns, with a woman's dowry serving as a crucial, tangible factor in her perceived worth. It wasn't about her character or her personal charm, but her material contribution that truly determined her marital prospects. Transgressions against the strict moral code, especially adultery, were not merely private affairs, but severe scandals. These could lead to immediate social ostracism and profound legal or social repercussions, underscoring the strict moral codes and the pervasive public shame associated with sexual conduct. There was no escaping the wagging tongues or the lasting stain on one's reputation. Concubinage, though, sometimes practiced by the elite, added layers of complexity to family structures. While not carrying the full recognition of marriage, these relationships often involved navigating delicate social and legal boundaries, existing in a semi-recognized status. It's a testament to the persistent human desire for companionship and connection, even when formal avenues were closed. Yet amidst all this contractual coldness, a surprising truth often emerged. Despite the pragmatic nature of these unions, some couples genuinely grew to love each other. Their partnerships weren't forged in grand romantic gestures, but by shared hardships, the steady accumulation of habits, and the mutual experience of daily survival. They found a quiet affection amidst the struggle, a bond born of shared resilience rather than initial passion. Imagine the profound sense of disappointment and quiet resentment that could fester when marrying for obligation rather than affection. Couples might quietly resent each other and attend separate feasts, their lives intertwined by contract but their hearts perhaps miles apart. Yet paradoxically for others, the slow, steady rhythm of shared life, the mutual support in the face of nature's fury and societal demands, could indeed blossom into a deep, if unromanticized, love. The subtle rustle of legal parchments and the solemn tones of the priest, accompanied by the murmured calculations of a dowry, physically represented the wealth and status that underpinned every marital negotiation. This was the cold, hard reality of medieval unions, a reality inextricably linked to the overwhelming weight of clan identity and reputation. The concept of I, or clan identity, was not just a social construct. It was an invisible cage deeply suppressing individualism in favour of the collective. Your family was your primary source of identity, reputation, and social standing overshadowing any personal desires you might possess. Imagine the agonizing pressure of knowing that your individual actions, particularly those related to marriage and honor, carry generational impact, reflecting directly on your entire lineage, both past and future, for good or ill. A single misstep could tarnish the name of your ancestors and burden your descendants, creating a profound web of duty and expectation. Scandal, especially something as dramatic as a noble elopement, was not merely a personal rebellion, but political sabotage. It was likened to lighting your family tree on fire, causing immense chaos and profound disgrace within the family and wider society. Public shame and pervasive gossip were powerful mechanisms of social control, ensuring that youthful indiscretions could be discussed in church for weeks long, after the event itself maintaining a constant state of vigilance and conformity. The collective reputation of the family dictated choices with an iron fist, with parents, priests, and the local gossip network, all playing critical roles in approving or disapproving courtships, ensuring unwavering conformity to societal expectations. The sharp intake of breath and the hushed whispers that followed a scandalous rumour through the village, feeling like invisible ropes tightening around those implicated, perfectly illustrate this relentless scrutiny, leading us now to the physical realities of medieval living conditions. The sharp intake of breath and the hushed whispers that followed a scandalous rumour tightening like invisible ropes around those implicated were a constant reminder of the pervasive social scrutiny that governed medieval lives. This relentless public gaze, combined with the stringent rules of courtship and marriage, brings us directly to the intimate details of daily existence and personal realities, particularly the physical context of intimacy within medieval living conditions and shelter. Beyond the social rules, the very structure of medieval housing dictated the possibilities for private moments, or rather the stark lack thereof. Housing structures varied dramatically across the social spectrum, from damp basic thatched huts, for the common folk to chilly echoing stone castles for the nobility. Yet a common thread ran through them all, a profound scarcity of true privacy for personal moments. For commoners, privacy was virtually non-existent. Imagine multiple generations, perhaps, including unrelated individuals like apprentices or distant relatives sharing a single small living space. Every conversation, every interaction, every tender gesture would be witnessed by others. This meant that truly private conversations or intimate moments, cherished as they are in our modern world, were rare luxuries snatched in fleeting glances across a crowded room or in hushed whispers only when absolute necessity demanded it. Noble homes, while significantly larger and more grand, offered little more genuine privacy. Their vast echoing halls and numerous chambers often had less thermal comfort than one might imagine, with drafts seeping through stone walls creating a constant chill. More importantly, they were perpetually filled with servants, retainers, and guards. An intimate moment between a noble couple might be interrupted by a page delivering a message or a chambermaid attending to the hearth. This constant presence of others limited any true private intimacy, forcing expressions of affection into the realm of the subtle and the clandestine, akin to the coded messages and tokens we discussed earlier. Upon marriage, peasant couples often moved into shared huts, perhaps joining the groom's family, or if resources allowed, building a new one with the collective help of the village. This communal effort symbolized a basic, profoundly practical commitment to shared domestic survival. The home itself, a testament to cooperation, underscored that a medieval marriage was often a basic practical alliance. The quiet longing for a truly private moment, a shared glance across a bustling communal space, was a constant undercurrent, a poignant reminder that true intimacy was a rare and precious luxury. The pervasive scent of hearth ash and damp earth in a peasant hut, or the echoing chill of a stone castle's corridors, made any attempt at quiet intimacy difficult if not impossible, casting a long shadow over daily life and relationships, and profoundly influencing the practicalities of partnership, especially concerning the daily need for food. The echoing chill of a stone castle's corridors and the pervasive scent of hearth ash in a peasant hut were not just atmospheric details, they were tangible expressions of a world where the practicalities of partnership, particularly concerning diet and sustenance, underpinned nearly every decision, including marriage. Common food sources were often monotonous and dictated by the seasons, reflecting a deep connection to the rhythms of agricultural life. Staples like grain, often made into a coarse bread or porridge, alongside root vegetables such as onions and turnips, defined the daily existence for the vast majority of the population. This pervasive reality of a limited diet influenced the very nature of marital negotiations, where a suitor's access to a fertile plot of land or the reliability of his family's harvest often mattered more than any romantic sentiment. Scarcity was not an occasional concern. It was a relentless, pervasive reality that defined much of medieval life. This made effective food preservation methods absolutely essential for survival through the lean, brutal months of winter. Imagine the quiet desperation of families during the hungry gap before the next harvest, relying entirely on preserved foods to stave off starvation. Thus, a potential spouse's knowledge of curing meats, pickling vegetables, or properly storing grain was a skill of paramount importance, far more valuable than any artistic talent or charming wit. The ability to provide food was a significant mark of a desirable spouse. A man who could gut a fish with practiced ease, or a family with a productive goat, were not merely attractive traits but vital assets for sheer survival. Class-based access to food was stark and undeniable. The pungent aroma of boiling cabbage and turnips, a constant companion to a peasant's pot, contrasted sharply with the richer, more complex scents of roasted meats and sweet pastries wafting from a lord's kitchen. While elites enjoyed a wider variety, even for them, food remained a central economic aspect of any household, a symbol of power and provision. The micronarrative of a peasant suitor cautiously offering his beloved a good turnip from his meagre harvest is not a trivial detail. It's a modest yet deeply meaningful gesture of provision in a world of scarcity, a subtle act of courtship speaking volumes about his practical capabilities. Each distinct aroma from the humble peasant's pot to the lord's abundant kitchen physically defined a class's daily sustenance, and by extension their marital considerations. This brings us to another unseen reality of medieval daily life hygiene and personal care. Daily hygiene practices for commoners were rudimentary, typically involving cold washes with basic, often homemade soap. Imagine the persistent earthy smell of unwashed bodies and damp clothing a stark background to daily life. This generally low standard of personal cleanliness meant that basic practicalities like a potential partner who doesn't visibly recoil at the sight of your feet were more relevant considerations than sophisticated grooming. The tokens exchanged, such as a sweaty linen sleeve, suggest a very different tolerance for personal odours and a more intimate, if perhaps unhygienic, connection through worn garments reflecting the inescapable realities of daily life, where closeness was often unavoidable. The unspoken discomfort of close proximity in a time of limited hygiene presented a subtle challenge to romantic ideals, occasionally broken by the fleeting scent of lavender on a noble's secret token, a brief whisper of luxury amidst the pervasive earthly smell of unwashed bodies and damp clothing. Amidst the persistent earthy smell of unwashed bodies and damp clothing, a constant backdrop to medieval life, the reality of daily labour and responsibilities formed the very bedrock of any shared existence. For peasants, life was a relentless cycle, dominated by physically demanding agricultural toil. Imagine the rhythmic thud of a peasant hoe breaking hard earth, or the steady, almost hypnotic pull of thread through fabric during embroidery, each sound a testament to the daily grind. They spent their days tilling fields, harvesting crops and milking animals from the first light of dawn until deep into the twilight hours. This wasn't merely work, it profoundly shaped their social interactions and the very nature of their relationships. Courtship, if it happened at all, often intertwined with these shared tasks. Conversations were not formal affairs in parlours. They unfolded organically during shared chores, like the trek to the local mill or while tending to sheep on a windswept pasture. This integration of social life into the rhythm of work meant that a potential partner's ability to perform their labour effectively was a key trait of desirability. Competence and reliability rather than charm or superficial good looks were paramount. A man who could consistently thatch a roof that didn't leak, or a woman skilled in preserving food for the winter were seen as far more valuable prospects. There was a quiet satisfaction in shared labour, an unsung form of love found in the mutual competence and resilience of a partner working alongside you, a practical bond forged in the crucible of necessity. For nobles, labour took a different form, but it was no less demanding. Women managed vast estates, overseeing numerous servants handling complex household accounts, and often engaging in skilled crafts like elaborate embroidery. For an unmarried noblewoman, particularly one whose family might not possess a substantial dowry, these skills were not hobbies. They were crucial pursuits demonstrating her potential contribution to a future household and her ability to run a significant establishment. Noble men, on the other hand, faced demanding social and administrative duties, managing sprawling lands, engaging in political intrigues, or enduring rigorous military training. These responsibilities consumed much of their time and energy, leaving precious little room for the leisurely pursuits of romance or personal leisure. Their lives were defined by duty and strategy, reflecting a stark contrast to the peasant's existence, yet both were preparing for their own predetermined futures. This brings us to the very foundation of medieval life, childhood and education, which served not for individual fulfillment, but as a meticulous preparation for these predetermined unions. For many, especially nobles, childhood was shaped by early betrothal, sometimes before your voice dropped, with first meetings between spouses occurring only on the wedding day itself, cementing a profound sense of predetermined fate. Education was strictly class-based and vocational. Peasant children learned practical skills essential for survival and contributing to the family unit, while noble children were prepared for their specific roles in courtly or military life, reflecting their expected station. Gender-specific training was prevalent. Girls were taught domestic skills and crafts like embroidery, while boys were prepared for physical labour or warfare, depending on their station, all in preparation for their future marriages. The purpose of childhood and education was never about individual fulfilment, but rather the stark preparation for an adult role that served the family's social and economic stability, particularly through strategic marriage alliances. Imagine the sombre acceptance of a preordained future, knowing that childhood was merely a training ground for a marriage that might never be about personal affection. The contrasting sounds of children learning practical tasks, the gentle slap of dough in a kitchen, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, each preparing them for their prescribed roles in a world where marriage was a contract, not a choice. This rigid, inescapable framework brings us to the very core of the medieval social hierarchy and fixed destiny. The contrasting sounds of children learning practical tasks, from the gentle slap of dough to the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, each preparing them for their prescribed roles in a world where marriage was a contract, not a choice, brings us to the ultimate, inescapable truth of medieval society, its rigid social hierarchy and fixed destiny. This unyielding order fundamentally determined an individual's destiny and matrimonial prospects from the moment of birth. Imagine being born into a world where your potential, your opportunities, and your very freedom to choose a partner were already largely set, unchangeable as the ancient stones of a castle. Personal desires, as we've explored throughout this journey, were always secondary to this fixed order. Parents, local lords, or powerful religious figures held immense, almost absolute authority over marriage decisions, especially for the nobility. For the elite, it was common to be betrothed since before your voice dropped, with solemn agreements made in infancy tying powerful families together for generations through strategic political and economic calculations. Marriage for the aristocracy was not about romance or personal affection. It was primarily about securing land titles and family alliances, reinforcing the cold, hard truth that individuals were often little more than strategic pawns in much larger political and economic games. Their personal affections were utterly irrelevant in the grand scheme of power and lineage. Even for peasants whose lives were perhaps less grandly political, the family still held a strong say, prioritizing practical skills and tangible resources like a productive goat or a boy who could thatch a roof over fleeting romantic sentiment. This strict economic underpinning defined the rules of marriage, rules as tangible as the very wealth beneath their feet. The silent, unspoken rules of deference and address permeated every social interaction, a constant hum of hierarchical awareness underlying daily life, dictating even the choice of a partner. This rigid social structure led directly to the core economic drivers of medieval life, which fundamentally dictated the terms of courtship and marriage, effectively transforming love into a transaction. Whether your world revolved around the agrarian cycle or the burgeoning trade of a town, the economy was the ultimate matchmaker. For men, proof of husband material required tangible assets, land or livestock or tools, or a roof that doesn't leak too much, with 2 healthy oxen, explicitly more valuable than mere love letters. For women, a dowry was a crucial prerequisite, whether coin clothing or a suspiciously generous number of geese, determining her marital prospects and perceived worth in the economic exchange. In some regions, the bride price, where the groom paid the bride's family with a horse, a cloak, and 3 pigs, underscored this transactional nature, a stark medieval romance at its finest. Marriage was inherently practical. For peasants, it was often driven by the utility of pig pen borders someone else's wheat field, settling for irrigation rights over romantic passion. The dowry typically became part of the husband's household economy, managed by him and guarded by law its return after annulment or death, often harder than pulling a sword from a stone, demonstrating the strict economic rules governing these unions. Beyond human systems, nature's relentless fury plagues harsh winters, floods. Famines created a constant struggle for survival that permeated all decisions, including marriage. The widespread lack of formal relief efforts meant communities relied on their own resources, making strong marital partnerships a matter of life and death. For peasants, the ability to survive winter together became the practical definition of chemistry, highlighting marriage as a strategic alliance against shared hardships. Marital partnerships were forged by the daily reality of hauling firewood in the rain, demonstrating that comfort and romance were secondary to resilience and pragmatic cooperation, underscoring the chilling realization that a partner's true value lay in their ability to endure hardship, not in their charm or looks. This sobering journey through the medieval heart shows us a world far removed from our own, where every aspect of life was bound by constraints we can barely imagine. As we gently drift back from the echoing stone halls and damp firelit huts of the Middle Ages, allow your mind to slowly release the intricate tapestry of constraints we've explored tonight. The pervasive weight of ancient hierarchies, the cold calculations of dowries and land rights, the ever-present shadow of nature's fury. These were the demanding realities that shaped love, courtship and marriage for so many centuries. It's a stark contrast, isn't it, to the freedoms we often take for granted today, the luxury of personal choice of seeking a connection based on shared laughter and affection rather than land titles and livestock. Imagine for a moment the quiet solace of your own bed, the warmth of your covers, the simple, profound privacy that medieval individuals so often longed for. Think of the modern convenience of fresh water, of food that isn't dictated by the immediate harvest of the freedom to simply be with someone you choose without the unblinking gaze of chaperones, or the fear of a misspoken word bringing shame upon your entire lineage. The past, in its own silent way, often whispers lessons of appreciation for the present. So as the last vestiges of medieval life gently fade from your thoughts, feel the weight of history lift, replaced by a profound sense of peace. Let the subtle scents of ancient hearths and damp earth dissolve, leaving only the comforting aroma of your own quiet space. Allow your breathing to deepen the rhythm of your heart to steady as the distant clatter of pewter and the solemn pronouncements of priests give way to the soft hush of your own night. The stories are told, the history absorbed, and now it is time for rest. Drift gently, knowing that in the quiet of this moment you are free and truly wonderfully at peace.